Hello, Elizabeth. How are you today?
Hi, Joanne. I'm fine. How about yourself?
Doing well. Glad to be
Great.
able to talk to you about your artwork.
Yeah,
Uh,
same here.
I have a couple of questions that might be useful to people seeing the video about your work. Um,
Okay.
for example, how did you come to the title of your paintings, your exhibit, Painting in Place?
Yeah, it's not immediately obvious maybe what that means, but when we moved to the northern Catskills 5 years ago, I found the quiet surroundings and the beauty of the area very conducive to painting. And I also found a wealth of subject matter right on our own property, right out the front door. So I just set about painting what interested me, just by walking outside and walking around the property, and I painted what spoke to me. So I painted in place.
And that lends that wonderful air of intimacy about your work. And no matter what the size, from the small still lifes to the four oaks, you get a sense of real understanding of your subject and a real passion for your work.
Yeah, I think the natural world is my springboard, and from there, I express what I want to say through that.
You might be anticipating my next question, which is which came first, your environmental interest or your painting?
That's an interesting question. As a child, I grew up really close to nature. My favorite playground was the forest and streams behind my parents' house. And I think I became aware of the fact that, the environment can degrade when the streams behind the house became polluted, and the fish and the frogs that we used to try to collect in buckets and things, those began to die. Um, at the same time, I was really attracted to art and music. And as a child, I used to try to copy paintings of Van Gogh and Cézanne, paintings that were hanging above my parents' sofa. I got myself some oil paints and would experiment with that. And I also like to try to draw my friends and family. But I never went into actually studying art. I went into studying music. My environmental awareness grew as an adult. I began painting seriously in 2001. As a matter of fact, the first painting I completed was on 9/11, oddly enough. I'd gone into art class, and then that occurred while I was there. So I would say my environmental interests definitely came first. It was a natural expression for me to use the art as a vehicle for expressing my environmental concerns.
Aha.
My first environmentally themed painting was the Sorrow of Sophia, which was in 2009. So in the beginning, when I was painting, I was simply doing things like still lives and, technical things that the instructor was having us do in order to gain skill. And then I eventually used some of my abilities to say what I wanted to say.
I recognize your storytelling ability in the Sorrow of Sophia. I was wondering, how does storytelling develop into a painting, or does your painting develop into your story?
Very interesting question again. Even though they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, I wouldn't say that I begin specifically with a story. I do definitely begin with images in my mind. Some image will strike me, and an image in itself, carries ideas with it. But most often I do not set out with an explicit story to tell in the beginning, but an image, and then the image speaks its own language. And as I paint, the story evolves and becomes more layered and becomes more clear. So I was thinking in that way, painting can be like poetry or even maybe writing a novel, where there are layers of meaning and the process kind of leads one into that meaning. And so that's what happens. I get led into it as I'm working. And then sometimes there's an aha moment where I realize this is it. this is what I want to say, and this is how I'm going to do it, which is always a really nice moment, but it doesn't always occur at the beginning.
Absolutely. I'm recognizing as you speak about poetry that I was recently listening to a podcast or a speech by Billy Collins about his process. And I recognize that process in what you're describing. So
yeah, it's interesting. And maybe throughout all the different artistic processes, there's that similar thread of discovery as you're going.
exactly. So can you briefly describe your process using the 3 paintings as an example? The Four Oaks series, or the Sorrow of Sophia, and your Windigo World?
Sure. And actually, I would say the process for each of those is quite different. The Four Oaks, I think in a sense there was less discovery as I was going with that, because I set out in the very beginning, I knew what I wanted to do, which was to chronicle what I saw as just like sad destruction of these gorgeous old oak trees that dated back to the Civil War. And these trees were growing behind our property, and one day I noticed they were marked with paint. They were scheduled to be cut down, and we contacted our neighbor, and we were actually able to save some of them out. And so I wanted to paint the living one and the ones that then had been destroyed, both by painting the cut trunk and then the tops that were fallen. They left some of the tops in place. So it was a very strong emotional reaction to the loss of these magnificent trees. Mostly I wanted to draw attention to the fact that they're living beings. Trees are living beings upon whom we depend. And taking their life shouldn't occur casually at this point because of the climate emergency that we're in. So I would simply take my paints and my canvas, and I literally went back into the woods and sat in front of, I found the vantage point I wanted, and then I worked. And with sometimes the help of my dogs, one of them was digging a hole, and at one point dirt got flung onto the canvas with wet paint, and it was quite an adventure painting those paintings. The Sorrow of Sophia was a very different process, even though it started out again with an old oak tree that was about 500 years old at the George Landis Arboretum in Esperance, New York. I loved that tree, and it had one of its branches just sort of reached down, and it seemed to be protective. It just was so alive. It has since died, but it became in my mind the symbol of the tree of life. And from its branches emerged Sophia, who is the goddess of wisdom in the Old Testament. I intentionally split the trunk apart by painting the tree on 2 separate canvases to symbolize that all is not well with our world. And Sophia looks down, the goddess looks down. She kind of emerges out of the branches and the clouds. So her wings were formed from clouds, and her shoulders were formed from the branches. And she looks down upon the earth with sorrow for what's happening. The original panel, the original painting consisted of 3 central panels. And then as I was working, I realized, okay, I wanted to expand it further to the left with more of the pastoral scene, and further to the right with more of the industrial scene. And so it definitely grew, as I was working, that story emerged. Windigo World was unlike either one of those previous 2, in that I had started doing some paintings by looking at rocks and stones, and threads of quartz would look like landscapes or would look like trees. And so I did 2 smaller paintings using a very small rock. And then I found this gorgeous big rock in the back of our property with a huge thread of quartz and just all these interesting cavities. And it was really evocative. And I'd been wanting to paint that rock for a long time. And I had a large canvas with another painting that wasn't going so well. And I thought, okay, I'm going to see what I can do with this. And my intention was just to paint an abstract. The thread of quartz became this big red line across the canvas, and then I started working in other areas, and it went through a lot of evolutions, a lot of permutations. And then there was this aha moment where the image emerged from my subconscious. I saw, okay, what I'm painting here is, this is a tree, a big red kind of threatening tree, and then there were rising seas and a lifeless landscape behind. And I realized again I was painting a warning of what could come to our world if we're not more careful. And I thought, okay, I'm painting the Windigo, and the Windigo is sort of the embodiment of greed in Native American mythology. And I think the warning is, if we are not careful with our greed in terms of what we are doing to the natural world, we're going to end up with a devastated, possibly lifeless world, which we don't want. So that process. It was definitely an aha moment with that painting. Yeah, so it really depends on what I'm painting.
Exactly. What you've just spoken about, Windigo World, extends unfortunately into what's happening with the pandemic at this moment. The greed, the worldwide concentration on production has changed our attitudes in big ways.
Yes, and I think it's changed the ecosystem in big ways. And so
Exactly.
in some ways, I feel as though that painting almost has a little bit of a strangely prophetic
Exactly.
sense about it. Yeah.
Well, I really believe that you've enriched your exhibit by speaking about it in so many wonderful ways, and your passion is evident. And thank you very much for sharing your ideas and your process.
Well, I'd like to thank you and Tannery Pond Center for the opportunity for having my art there. And even though people haven't been able to see it in person, maybe I'll be optimistic and I'll say yet. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have it happen virtually. So thank you very much.
Wonderful to see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.